future doctors. Welcome back to Best Medicine's AQA GCSE Biology series. Today is a very important day because today we'll be beginning one of the most important, one of my personal favorites, and a chapter which will stick with you probably for the rest of your life if you're going to go into medicine. This particular chapter is called Biological Responses. Okay? Biological responses. It essentially deals with some very important information, introductory information about the physiology of human body. Okay? So, beginning with the first topic, that's going to be the human nervous system. The human nervous system. So we're going to start with the meme. Friend, just go talk to her, don't be nervous, and me talking to her. Yep, so anyways, I'm not a big fan of the human nervous system because it makes me nervous and sometimes gives me anxiety and depressed, so I really have a big beef with this guy, right? I have a big beef with the guy. I just want to meet this guy. I just want to talk. So anyways, before we dive into the nervous system, we have to understand the principles of coordination, principles of being able to regulate the internal environments of the body. So what is that? That's called homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Homeostasis is just a fancy word that we give to regulate the activities of the body according to normal levels. For example, we could have temperature, right? Temperature can be, our normal human body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, and if it increases, then we gotta decrease it, and if it decreases, then we gotta increase it, and that is the homeostasis of temperature. We also have blood pressure. Our blood pressure normally is 120 by 80 millimeters of Hg. If it increases too much, we gotta decrease it. If it decreases too much, we gotta increase it. And so again, that is the homeostasis of blood pressure. So homeostasis essentially is just a combination of all the processes that are involved in maintaining our internal environments according to normal levels. So, for example, homeostasis of temperature, homeostasis of blood glucose, homeostasis of blood concentration and pressure, etc. Okay? So how does homeostasis actually work, right? Before we go deeper into the nervous system, we gotta understand how the homeostasis would essentially pan out. So it works in the following ways. Basically, there's a change, there's a stimuli that is detected by the receptors. So let me quickly show you here. For example, something in the body changes, like there's an increase of something or a decrease of something, right? And that is the change. So that is the change. This change stimulates some receptors in the body. So you'll have receptors that's gonna be stimulated. So what the receptors are gonna do is that they're gonna detect that, okay, something in the body has changed. It has either increased or decreased away from normal. So we gotta go ahead and correct this. So next thing that's gonna happen is we're gonna have coordination centers, right? Coordination centers. That decide response, right? Okay, they will decide, basically we need to bring such a change so that we're going to have the opposite of the change that has occurred. For example, if there's an increase, the coordination centers will say, okay, we got to do this thing to make this decrease. So they decide the response. And then eventually you'll have some effector organs that are going to carry out that response. And then you're going to have effectors that are going to carry out that response. And you would have the opposite of that change, and the level or the activity will go back to normal. So that is homeostasis. It essentially works by a system of something called negative feedback. What is a negative feedback mechanism? Negative feedback, which is a high yield term you need to be aware of, essentially means some processes that cause a negative of a change, okay? A negative of a change. For example, an increase of anything causes a decrease in that thing. increase in blood pressure will cause, as a result, a decrease of blood pressure, right? It's kind of like you are my student and I'm your teacher, or I'm your parent even, and you get some really bad marks, right? If you get bad marks, I'm gonna give you a negative feedback. I'm gonna say, okay, that's not good, right? You need to work hard, and that's negative feedback. And so the next thing you do is you start working hard, right? And you do a lot of revision and a lot of practice, and in the next test you get really good marks. So initially there was a decrease in your marks, and then I had that entire negative feedback effect on you, and now you get good marks. So a decrease has led to an increase, right? So that is negative feedback. A change will cause an opposite of that change. So for example, if your temperature increases, then the body will try to decrease the temperature, right? A very popular example that we'll do in a bit is the increase in something called thyroid stimulating hormone concentration. We'll do more on this later. Increase in thyroid stimulating hormone is going to increase secretion of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland, which is going to result in a decrease in TSH, which is going to decrease thyroid hormone. Okay, so we'll cover this later as well. And that is homeostasis. Okay? And we have a meme. When negative feedback finally evens out my hormones. And I'm like, homeostasis. What is positive feedback? If there's negative feedback, of course there has to be a positive feedback as well, right? Positive feedback would be that you get good marks, right? For example, you get good marks and I give you a pat on the back. I encourage you. I say, okay, that's a really good effort. That's wonderful, right? And you see that I'm pleased with you, and you work even harder, and you do even more revision because you've just received positive feedback. And so in the next test, you get even more marks. You get even more marks. So an increase has led to a further increase in your marks. That is positive feedback. This is usually not discussed in AQA. So we're not going to go in too much of a detail on this. However, essentially what it means is that an increase, for example, will cause more of that change, more increase. A decrease will cause a more decrease. Okay? So homeostasis is mainly performed by two systems of the human body. One of them is in the discussion today, that's the nervous system, and the other one is called the endocrine system. So we're just going to try to simply introduce the endocrine system, and we'll do more on this later. So what is the endocrine system? The endocrine system essentially mostly uses a system of negative feedback loops to bring changes. And to be able to do this, it uses hormones, okay? And hormones are secreted from glands. Different glands in the body will secrete different hormones. And then these hormones will travel through blood, so internally, to target effector organs and bring about changes. Examples of hormones include insulin, glucagon, adrenaline, FSH, LH, etc. So more on this later in its own chapter. But essentially what I mean by this is that if this is a human body, right, then these are some glands that I want to mention here. So there's one gland here that's called pituitary gland. Okay, here's the thyroid gland. And then this right here is the pancreas. And over here we have, on top of the kidneys, the adrenal glands. Okay, and over here, this is a gland in the male. Testes also secrete some hormones. Now, all of these, also in females, you would have a uterus, right? So in females, there's a uterus, the pear-shaped organ, kind of like this, and then it's connected to each of the ovaries here. And the uterus is able to also secrete some hormones. So uterus, or let's say ovaries, are able to secrete some hormones in females, while testes secrete some hormones in males. So all of these are glands that are interconnected by blood vessels. So you'll have blood vessels running throughout the body, and these are able to transport these hormones. So again, hormones are chemical messengers that are released by glands, and they travel through blood to their target organs. An example of this would be insulin, for example. Insulin causes decrease in blood sugar by increasing the conversion of glucose to glycogen, for example. So you would have insulin being secreted by the pancreas. It's going to go into blood, and then from the blood it's going to go into the liver, for example, and then in the liver it's going to cause that change of storing glucose into glycogen. So more on this later, but this is just an example. Now here's the thing, this is going to take a long time because it's using hormones and it needs to travel by blood from one place to another, and it takes time to secrete the hormones, and it also takes time for the hormones to travel to their target organs. The nervous system is a little bit different. How does the nervous system work? Let's have a look, right? So the nervous system. What is the nervous system? The nervous system is made up of two parts: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, it consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, what they do is they receive information, they're able to interpret it, understand it, and they are able to generate a response. Okay, so what about the peripheral nervous system? The peripheral nervous system is able to deliver information to the CNS and away from the CNS, and that's what it does. So the peripheral nervous system only contains these organs, nerves, okay? Only nerves, while the CNS contains brain and spinal cord. So peripheral nervous system, it transmits sensory information from receptors to the CNS and motor information from the CNS to effector organs. How does this work? Okay, so the way it works is that in the nervous system, you have the brain, right? Every single person has a brain, and then they have the spinal cord, right? And the spinal cord descends all the way through the spine to the lower back, and from it emerge a lot of nerves, right, throughout the body. So spinal cord is giving out all of these nerves that are going to different parts of the body, and as it terminates, right, it's going to give out some nerves. So it's giving out these nerves which are going to the legs and so on. Also the brain emits some nerves as well. So the brain, right, and the spinal cord together, they're called the central nervous system. Okay, central nervous system. So brain and spinal cord are involved in receiving information from different parts of the body, interpreting it, understanding it, and generating a response. What about the nerves? The nerves, right, are part of the peripheral nervous system, right, because it's in the peripheries. The peripheral nervous system is involved in taking information from receptors. So maybe there's a receptor here, right? Could be a pain receptor, touch receptor, pressure receptor, temperature receptor. It's going to take information through the nerve to the CNS, right? To the spinal cord, for example. And that information is received by the CNS, and then it's interpreted there. A response could be generated, and then that response is delivered to a target organ, right, an effector, again through nerves. So nerves are involved purely on carrying information away from receptors or towards effector organs. Okay, the brain and spinal cord are only involved in receiving this information coming from nerves, interpreting it, understanding it, and coordinating a response and sending that response to a nerve. And then the nerve, again, which is part of the PNS, will take it to the effector organ. Okay? Now here's the thing. The way this information is carried is by electrical impulses. So you actually have electrical impulses traveling through nerves from the receptors to the CNS, and from the CNS to the effector organs through the PNS. All of these, this information is carried in the form of electrical impulses. And so because electricity travels really, really fast, the information traveling and essentially the effects of nervous system are also really quick, right? Very quick responses in the nervous system. Another thing about the nervous system is that its responses usually are short-term, okay? Short-term responses. So let's have a, remember the endocrine system, right? The endocrine system is a system of hormones. So it involves basically a system of glands that are interconnected by blood vessels, and those glands produce hormones which go into the blood, and from the blood they go into different effector organs. While in the CNS, you have the nerve impulses that are generated from receptors, go into the CNS, and from the CNS, a response is generated, again in the form of electrical impulses that go through the nerves to the effector organs. So a couple of differences between the two that we need to know, we need to list them down, and hopefully a question on this shows up so you can get full marks. Well, the nervous system has fast responses. Of course it's fast, right? Because it's using electrical impulses. Endocrine system, again, has slow responses because it takes time for the hormones to be produced and for the hormones to travel through blood from one place to another. The nervous system uses electrical impulses to transmit information, while endocrine system uses hormones to transmit information. Nervous system uses nerves as a medium. Endocrine system, nerves, or you could also say neurons, okay? Neurons as a medium. Endocrine system uses blood as a medium, okay? Nervous system has short-lasting responses. Endocrine system usually has long-lasting responses. So if a question on this shows up, I hope you can write this one first, and then this one second, and probably this one as third, and then if it's for 4 marks, then you can add this fourth one, okay? And that is the introduction to the nervous system. Now, before going into the detailed structures of the nervous system, we need to understand the different kinds of cells that make up the nervous system. And the cells of the nervous system are called neurons, right? Nerve cells are called neurons. Now, there's 3 different kinds of neurons, but generally what a neuron consists of, and we already mentioned this when we were doing chapter number 1, is that it contains a cell body with a nucleus. It contains these long extensions called dendrites, which help make connections, and a long extension, a single long extension called the axon, right? The axon, which helps transmit information over long distances, okay? So that's generally the structure of a neuron. Now there's 3 different kinds of neurons. One of them is called a sensory neuron, right? A sensory neuron. So what is a sensory neuron? A sensory neuron essentially is connected to receptors, and it carries sensory information from the body to the CNS. So it is connected to receptors, and it's going to carry sensory information from the body to the CNS. Cell body is outside the CNS. So let me quickly illustrate this for you. So for example, you have the eye, right? It generates a sensory information, visual sensation, right? Eye has visual receptors that are able to detect visual information. So the neuron that is connected to the receptors in the eyes, by the way, the receptors in the eyes, the visual receptors, do you know what they're called? They're called rods and cones, okay? Rods and cones are visual receptors in the eyes. So the eye contains these receptors, visual receptors for visual sensation, and each of them is connected by a neuron, okay? So you'll have this neuron that has a cell axon here, right? Kind of like this. Extension here, here's the cell body, and then it's going to take this to the brain, right? To the CNS. So again, that's a sensory neuron. A sensory neuron takes sensory information from receptors and carries it to the CNS. Now, instead of the eye or the visual receptors, you could also have some other kinds of receptors. For example, can you make any guesses? Like sensation of smell, right? Smell receptors in the nose, right? This could be in the nose, and then again, you would have smell receptors here, which are attached to sensory neurons, which are carrying that information to the CNS. You could also have something like pain receptors. And what receptors are present in our tongue? Taste receptors, right? Taste buds, we call them, are also connected to sensory neurons, which are gonna carry this sensory information to the CNS, to the brain. Then the other kind of neurons are those that are present purely in the CNS, right? Purely in the CNS. And those are called relay neurons. Relay neurons are also called interneurons. Okay, I want to quickly write this down. These are also called interneurons. And you can try to remember this because these are present internally in the CNS, right? And not outside in the peripheries in the PNS. So interneurons or relay neurons are present inside the CNS purely. So what I mean by this is that remember what the CNS contains. The CNS contains brain and spinal cord. So both brain and spinal cord are made up of purely relay neurons, okay? Now, what do the relay neurons do? Well, these are the ones that are present in the brain and spinal cord, so they're the ones that are going to perform the function of the brain and the spinal cord. So these are the ones that will receive the information from sensory neurons, and then they will interpret that information, and then they will generate a response, which could then be transmitted to a motor neuron, okay? So what I mean by this is that here's the CNS, right? We were talking about this. So in the CNS, what you would have is the CNS neuron. So you'll have a neuron here, which is forming a connection, right? So here's a neuron. And it's got this axon here, right? And then it's got the dendrites and everything, right? And then you'll have many of these connected. I'm just drawing one of them for illustration, but you'll have many of these, right? Making a lot of connections. And then after receiving that sensory information, they will try to understand it. They will try to interpret it. For example, you're looking at a screen right now, right? And you're seeing this white-colored background with red-colored text and black-colored text, and you're trying to make sense of it. Your brain is trying to make sense of it. And that is happening right now in relay neurons, okay, in your brain. So relay neurons are present purely in the CNS. Both the brain and the spinal cord contain relay neurons. So after they generate a response, for example, you're seeing this right now and you're trying to probably store this in a memory, they generate a response and it's carried out by a motor neuron usually. So a motor neuron will then carry out a response to a target organ. Maybe we can change the example here. Maybe you're trying to see a football coming directly to your face, right? So if you see a football coming directly to your face, one of the things would be to raise your hand to try to block it, or maybe bend down your legs to be able to crouch down and dodge it, right? So a football is coming towards your face and you're seeing this. The sensory neuron is carrying the visual sensation to the CNS. The CNS relay neurons will interpret that, and then eventually they will generate a response. The response then is transmitted to yet another kind of neuron, and that neuron is called a motor neuron. So we have another kind of neuron here, okay? And this is going to go ahead and take that information to the target organ, the effector. All right, and this is a motor neuron. Now the motor neuron is, again, part of the PNS. Let's have a look here in the text as well. So a motor neuron, it takes motor information such as information to move your muscles, or information towards your glands to start secreting some hormones or stop secreting some hormones, etc. So motor neuron takes motor information from the CNS to effector organs. Let's, for example, in this case, maybe it's taking it to a muscle, right? And then the muscle will move to block the football. So these are three different kinds of neurons. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put them together in a reflex arc in a bit. And first, let's do the structures of the brain. Okay, so here's what a brain looks like again, right? Kind of like this, and then you've got the medulla and the pons and the medulla, and then you've got a hindbrain at the back, right? And that is called the cerebellum. And it descends down as the spinal cord. Now the brain has a couple of parts, okay? All of this is the brain, okay? All of this is the part of the brain. So the brain consists of these wrinkly we call them gyri and sulci in medical terms. This wrinkled portion at the top, the big portion that you usually consider as the brain, that is called the cerebrum. Okay, you can call it the cerebrum, or you can call it the cerebral cortex. Okay, or you can call it the cerebral hemispheres, because you've got two of them. Now, the cerebrum is involved mostly in all of your voluntary activities, your thinking, your perception, your memory, your movement of all voluntary muscles. For example, you're trying to speak right now, right? Speaking is also involved. If you're trying to speak right now, listening, again, is a voluntary activity. You're trying to store that memory, and so on. It's a conscious activity. So all the conscious activities are done by cerebrum, right? So you can say consciousness, memory, right? Speaking, movement, voluntary movement. Like if you decide to get up from your chair, that's the cerebrum planning and coordinating that, planning that activity at least. Voluntary movement. Sensations, etc. If you feel pain, cerebrum is involved in feeling pain. And next up we have this little brain here. This is also a wrinkly part. It's kind of like a smaller cerebrum, really, but this one is called a cerebellum. Okay, don't confuse the two ever. This is a cerebellum, not a cerebrum. Okay, very similar terms, but this is a cerebellum. Cerebellum is involved in coordinating muscle activities. Okay, coordinating, not planning them, but coordinating muscle activities so that we're able to maintain balance or learn to walk, etc. Coordination of muscle activities. For example, balancing, riding a skateboard, right? Walking. And if you close your eyes right now and you're able to touch your nose, cerebellum is involved in that, right? So balancing and everything. So imagine if the cerebellum is damaged, right? If the cerebellum is damaged, the people would not be able to balance themselves, they would not be able to ride a bicycle, not be able to walk properly, etc. And next up, we have the medulla. So medulla is here. This one is called the pons. Okay, there are two protrusions basically. The top one is called the pons, which is not involved in AQA GCSE, but the lower one is called the medulla, and that is our concern. So medulla is involved in involuntary activities, unconscious activities, such as those that don't need our conscious efforts. For example, you're trying to breathe, right? When you're breathing, usually it's an involuntary activity, or it's a non-conscious activity. Your heart beating, right? You don't control when your heart is beating. That is controlled by the medulla. Your rate of digestion, your ability to urinate, etc. So medulla is involved in unconscious, involuntary activities. For example, breathing, right? Breathing is usually involuntary. Heart rate, digestion, and to be able to pee, it's called micturition, okay, etc. So that is the medulla. On top of this, in the brain, we have a very special part right about here, okay? And this right here is called the hypothalamus. and it's a very, very important part for this particular chapter. It's involved in a lot of coordination activities. It's involved in a lot of homeostasis. It's involved in a lot of hormonal coordination. So this is called the hypothalamus. And what this does is that it contains receptors and essentially regulates homeostasis. Has receptors. For example, it has the receptors for judging the blood concentration. And body temperature has receptors. For example, osmoreceptors. Remember osmosis? So osmo is concentration of the water content of the blood. Osmoreceptors are present in the hypothalamus. It contains receptors for temperature. Internal temperature of the human body. Internal temperature receptors. So because it is able to judge these things and detect if they're increasing or decreasing, it is able to regulate activities, coordinate activities to be able to bring them back to normal, to be able to do homeostasis for example, concentration of the blood, right? Water content of the blood, or for the temperature of the human body. So that's the hypothalamus. Now here's the thing, situated just below the hypothalamus is a very important gland, and we need to know this, okay? It's a very important gland. It's also called the master gland of the human body. And I've seen this on the AQA GCSE paper. They asked, why is the pituitary gland, which this is called the master gland of the human body? Why is it called a master gland? Okay, so more on that later in its own chapter, but this is the pituitary gland, and it secretes some hormones. The names of hormones, just for mentioning, the names of hormones that pituitary gland produces is ADH, which goes to the kidney and helps regulate blood water levels. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. This helps in female menstrual cycle. Luteinizing hormone, LH, which helps in ovulation. And TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone essentially just goes to the thyroid gland and stimulates it for production of thyroid hormone, which is thyroxine. Okay? Briefly stating, the reason why pituitary gland is called the master gland of the human body is because it is able to control the secretions of a lot of the other glands of the human body. Okay? So these are the parts of the brain. What about the spinal cord? Well, the spinal cord, let's just extend this a little bit. Okay, and let's make a cross section here. So I'm just going to cut a piece here and bring it over to this side. So as I cut this piece, here's the piece of the spinal cord, right? The spinal cord contains a gray area, which is butterfly shaped, kind of like this. Okay, looks a little bit like an H as well. And this is a little bit grayer, okay? And this is called the gray matter. While the surrounding is a bit white, and this is called the white matter. And the spinal cord essentially is involved in reflexes, automatic responses. It is also involved in carrying information from the PNS to the CNS, and from the CNS to the PNS. So what it contains essentially are connections to those nerves that we saw earlier. Let's have a look at the Porphyrius diagram again. So here's the nerves, right? And these nerves are extending from the spinal cord. So either they're taking information from receptors to the CNS, or from the CNS to the organs. And the spinal cord contains connections to these nerves. So let's have a look here. Remember what kind of neurons would be present inside the spinal cord? Those would be the relay neurons, okay? The relay neurons are present here. So that's a relay neuron. Now let's say there is a temperature receptor near a hand. Okay, and let's assume that this is my hand. All right, if it's my hand, here's what's going to occur. I'm going to try to take a lighter, or somebody else maybe takes a lighter and lights a fire underneath my my finger here. So as soon as my finger receives the sensation of this fire, what's going to happen is that it will have a receptor here, right? A temperature receptor. This receptor is connected to a sensory neuron. This receptor will generate an electrical impulse, right? Because remember, this is a temperature receptor. So because this is a temperature receptor, as soon as you give it a temperature, it's going to detect that and generate an electrical impulse. Now, receptors are connected to sensory neurons. So it's going to generate the electrical impulse, which is going to be carried by a sensory neuron, right, all the way to the spinal cord. Okay? Here's the catch. No catch, but generally a statement is that the sensory neuron's cell body is present outside the CNS. And it's going to take it to the CNS, the spinal cord. Now, if you notice closely, the sensory neuron is carrying the sensory information, the sensation of temperature, to the back side of the spinal cord. Okay, this is the back side. We also call it, back is also called the dorsal side. So it takes it to the dorsal, this little horn thingy, right? It kind of looks like a horn, so it takes it to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Now, you don't need to know the word dorsal horn, but essentially it takes it to the back side of the spinal cord. So a sensory neuron takes sensory information from the receptors in the form of electrical impulses to the CNS. Okay? Its cell body lies outside the CNS. There, it makes a connection with the neuron of the CNS. Right? It's going to make a connection here. Now, a connection between neurons is called what? Any guesses? A connection between neurons is called a synapse. So it makes a synapse here. This is called a synapse. A synapse is a connection between two neurons, or a neuron, and some other cell. So we have the sensory neuron. This is a sensory neuron. And it's bringing the temperature sensation to the posterior, the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. There it is making a connection with the relay neuron. And as it makes the connection with the relay neuron, the synapse with the relay neuron will do what the relay neurons will do what the CNS does. The relay neuron will receive the information, understand it, interpret it, and then generate a response. And relay neuron will generate the response of maybe, just maybe, flexing my bicep, right, to pull away my hand. So I'll have probably a muscle here, right, that's my bicep. And the relay neuron will decide, okay, we gotta go ahead and flex the bicep because our hand is gonna burn. So the relay neuron is gonna generate the response, and it's gonna be transferred to the motor neuron, which is gonna carry it to the muscle. So the relay neuron generates this response, and it is transmitted to the motor neuron. And have a look. The motor neuron cell body is inside the CNS. So it makes a synapse here. The relay neuron, through a synapse, transmits the response information to the motor neuron. The motor neuron then carries it all the way to the target organ and makes a synapse there, causing the target organ, causing the effector organ to undergo the response, undergo the function. So in this case, in our example, the motor neuron is carrying this motor information, the effector information, to contract my bicep. And as my bicep contracts, my hand will be pulled away from the flame. Now, this entire cycle of events happens very, very quickly, right? Very quickly, in a matter of milliseconds. And secondly, it happens so quickly that we're not actually consciously involved in it, right? It happens reflexively. So because we're not consciously involved in it, and because it happens very quickly, we call that a reflex, okay? A reflex. So what is a reflex? A reflex is a quick reflex. What is a reflex? And it comes for 2 marks usually, where they ask you to elaborate a little bit on this, or they give you an example, and they might say, like, why is this a reflex, right? They might give you this example and they say, okay, why is this a reflex? And you will say, this is a reflex because this particular example is very quick, right? Very quick response, because reflexes are quick, and because there is no conscious involvement. The response is automatic. And yeah, so this entire thing is called a reflex arc, and it's a very high yield topic, very high yield topic for AQA GCSE. So this is called a reflex arc. So let's quickly repeat on this. Generally, you will have a receptor that detects a particular sensation, and then that receptor generates an electrical impulse. That electrical impulse is carried by a sensory neuron to the CNS, where it makes synapse with a relay neuron. The relay neuron receives the information, understands it, interprets it, and then generates a response. That response information is then carried to a motor neuron, which carries it to the target organ, the effector organ, okay? And that is generally what a reflex arc is. So instead of having a temperature receptor, they could give you many different kinds of receptors. For example, the visual receptors, the taste receptors, the smell receptors, the noise receptors even. But the arc pretty much will remain the same. They might even add another cell here somewhere in the middle, right? Instead of having one relay neuron, they might add two relay neurons, right? But do not be confused. Just describe it as, and they might ask you to elaborate on this, so just describe it as from sensory neuron to first relay neuron, then second relay neuron, and then eventually to the motor neuron and so on, right? Always in your answers, mention the word synapse. Do not leave that one out, all right? Okay. Right, so let's have a look at the summary of this. Again, the brain consists of the cerebral cortex, which is the big main wrinkle part of the brain, which contains the sulci, which is the intrusion, and the gyri, which are the protrusions. It controls all the voluntary activities, for example, skeletal muscle movement, thinking, sensation, emotions, memory, speaking, and understanding, right? Cerebellum, which is the small wrinkled part at the back, and it's also called the hindbrain, that is involved in muscle coordination and balance. So they can give you a question like, a person was learning to skateboard, right? And which part of the brain would be most likely involved to carry out that activity? And you will then choose the option of cerebellum. And the other one is the hypothalamus, which is the homeostatic center of the brain. It is involved in regulation of appetite, blood water levels, body temperature, control of pituitary gland as well, because it is present. Remember, the hypothalamus is present right on top of the pituitary gland, and therefore it is able to influence the activities of the pituitary gland. And the fourth thing that we discussed was the medulla. Medulla consists of the unconscious involuntary activities, for example, breathing, heart rate, digestion, micturition, etc. Okay? Here. Hypothalamus adjusts body temperature to keep it warm during winter, and I take ice cold shower. Hypothalamus. My joke to you. Medulla. Medulla is involved in involuntary activities such as the heart rate, the breathing, digestion, and peristalsis. Remember, peristalsis is the movement of gastrointestinal muscles to process food along. So medulla, of course, will be involved in digestion and its involuntary movements with muscles. Pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is situated below the hypothalamus, and so hypothalamus has a major influence on the pituitary gland. And it is also known as the master gland of the body because it controls secretions from many other glands. It secretes hormones such as thyroid-stimulating hormone, FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and anti-diuretic hormone. And well, we conclude with a meme. So I breathe air for you, that's the lungs. I pump blood for you, heart. Okay, I filter waste for you, that's the liver. And then the brain is saying, reach for the officer's gun. That's why I have a beef with this guy, right? Always giving me stupid ideas. You must be cerebellum, okay? You must be my cerebellum because I can't stand when I'm without you. Aha. A biology pickup line. The spinal cord. The spinal cord is a long cylindrical structure composed of nervous tissue and transmits signals between brain and the rest of the body, enabling movement and sensation. So when the spinal cord kicks in and your reflexes keep you from getting hurt. involved in reflexes. So types of nerve cells, we've already done these. And here's us right now, right? Our neurons when they start learning about neurons. That's us. The neurons say, okay, that's me, right there. Okay, synapse. So remember, a synapse is a connection between two, either a neuron and some other cell, or a neuron and another neuron. Now, the way a synapse works essentially is that it works through a gap in which chemical messengers are transmitted. So what I mean by this is that, let's say here's a neuron, and here's a neuron, right? And it's got this axon, and it's bringing this axon terminal and so on. And then you would have, let's say, another neuron here, or some other cell, whatever cell it is. It could be a neuron, could be a muscle cell, whatever it is. What happens here is that you've got this electrical impulse coming in, right, through the neuron. And as it comes in to this part here, the axon terminal contains these chemical messengers that are transmitted over this gap. So there's a gap here. There's no direct connection. This gap in total is called the synapse with everything in it. So a synapse is a connection that involves a gap here. So the way information is transmitted is by these little chemicals that are released from the cell membrane as the electrical impulse arrives on the axon terminal, and it diffuses on to the cell. As it diffuses on, the cell will have receptors for these particular messengers, and then they will bind to the cell, triggering a response. For example, the cell could be a muscle cell. And so when these chemical messengers bind to the receptors of the muscle cell, they could cause it to contract or cause it to relax, and so on. By the way, these chemical messengers that are present in between the space between the neurons, a little bit of a cleft between the synapse, a little bit of a cleft between the synapse, that's called the synaptic cleft. And these chemicals are called, because they're transmitting nerve impulses, right? These are called neurotransmitters. Okay, these chemicals are called neurotransmitters. A popular neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, if you want to know, although it's not part of at least GCSEs. Okay, so a synapse essentially is just a connection between a neuron and another cell, which involves a little bit of a space through which neurotransmitters diffuse and bind to receptors on the next cell, transmitting electrical information through a chemical way. However, this does not take as long as the endocrine system and the hormones and so on. It's very, very quick, and it occurs in milliseconds. So here's a synapse again. If you notice on the diagram, you've got these two neurons, and between them at the connection site you have vesicles that are depositing these neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters are diffusing to receptors on the next cell, transmitting the electrical information. So a synapse essentially is just a junction between a neuron and another cell where neurotransmitters are released to transmit chemical signals, enabling communication within the nervous system. Okay? And another thing that we finished is the reflex arc. So remember, a reflex arc starts from receptors. The receptors will detect sensation. So for example, in this diagram, we have these receptors here, and these are detecting, let's say, temperature or pain, whatever it is. And that is transmitted to a sensory neuron. So here's a sensory neuron that is transmitted to a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is going to take it to the CNS. So here's the CNS. This entire thing is the CNS. The sensory neuron takes the sensation to the CNS, where it makes a connection, a synapse, with a relay neuron. So sensory neuron makes a synapse with a relay neuron. It transmits information to the relay neuron. The relay neurons will then interpret information and generate a response. And the response could be on a muscle. Now this response is transmitted to a motor neuron by a synapse, and the motor neuron cell body is inside the CNS. The motor neuron then delivers the motor information to an effector by a synapse, which can be a muscle or a gland, to bring about a desired response. It should be bring, and so on. Okay, so hopefully you can code this and write this as your answer when they try to help make you elaborate on the reflex arc, because this is a very high yield concept, reflex arc, and most often comes in every year on the exam. So hopefully you guys can get full marks on this, because it's most probably going to come in your exam. And next up, we have the human eye.